She cooked every bite of that wedding feast. She built that cake with her own 2 hands. And when the applause filled the hall, the bride turned to the crowd and said, "I taught her everything she knows." The room went silent. 400 people. Every fork frozen mid-air. Eliza Mercer stood in the doorway of the kitchen, flour still on her hands, her dead mother's apron tied around her waist. And she heard every word. This is the story of a woman nobody was supposed to see. A widow who fed an entire territory and was never meant to receive a single thank you. And the moment one man decided that was no longer acceptable. Stay with me until the end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind came early that year. By the second week of October, it was already cutting down from the north with a meanness that felt personal. The kind of cold that found every gap in your walls, every crack in your foundation, every place where the wood had shrunk away from the frame over years of hard use. It rattled windows and pushed under doors and woke you up at 3 in the morning with the certainty that something was wrong, even when nothing was, except the cold itself. Eliza Mercer knew that wind the way she knew her own breathing. She had lived in the small whitewashed cottage on the eastern edge of Red Hollow for 3 years now, 2 of them alone, and she had learned to read the weather the way some women read scripture, with attention, with a kind of reverence born not from faith but from necessity. She was 26 years old, and she was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. She was up before 4 most mornings, feeding wood into the cast iron stove in the kitchen before the room temperature had climbed past what her breath could fog. The stove was the best thing in the house. The one thing Thomas had bought her before the fever took him, back in the winter of 1880. "A good stove," he'd said, handing her the receipt with an almost embarrassed pride, as if he were apologizing for not being able to give her more. A good stove outlasts most men anyway. He'd been right about that, at least. The cottage was small enough that the stove's heat eventually reached every corner, but it took time, and in those first gray minutes of morning, Eliza worked in her coat, cracking eggs and measuring flour with fingers that moved from memory rather than thought. She made 4 dozen dinner rolls every morning, 2 pans of cornbread, and whatever pies she could manage before the light came up enough to make deliveries. Peach when she could get the fruit, apple in autumn, dried cherry and brown sugar through the worst of winter when the root cellar got down to its last stores. She delivered to the hotel, to Mrs. Hargrave's boarding house on the main street, and to 3 or 4 private homes where women either didn't have the time or didn't have the skill, but had enough money to pay someone else to cover the difference. It wasn't much. It covered the flour and the lard and the sugar and the small necessities. It didn't cover the mortgage note, which had been building interest since Thomas died, and which Mr. Calloway at the First Territorial Bank had stopped pretending was not a serious problem. "Mrs. Mercer," he'd told her 2 weeks ago, sitting behind his oak desk with his hands folded like he was about to say grace, "I've extended considerable patience given your circumstances. But the bank's board has obligations of its own." She'd sat across from him in her good dress, the brown wool, the one she saved for town, and kept her face very still. "How long do I have?" "If you can bring the account current by the 1st of December, we can continue the current arrangement." He'd paused. "If not, we would need to begin proceedings." Proceedings. The word sat in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying ever since. $43.16. That was how far behind she was. A number that sounded manageable until you mapped it against what she made, which averaged out to somewhere between $6 and $8 a month on a good month. She had 6 weeks. She needed a miracle or something close enough to one that the difference didn't matter. The miracle, as it turned out, arrived in the form of Martha Greer. Martha ran the dry goods store with her husband Frank and was the closest thing Eliza had to a friend in town, which said something about both of their circumstances. They were both too busy for anything that resembled a genuine social life, and their friendship had developed in the margins of commerce, 10 minutes here and there across the store counter, threading through topics from the practical to the personal without ever quite landing anywhere deep enough to call intimate. But Martha knew Eliza's situation, and Martha knew most of what happened in Red Hollow before it happened to anyone else. And that afternoon she found Eliza loading flour sacks into her handcart with the focused silence of a woman rationing her own worry. "You hear about the Brennan wedding?" Martha asked, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. Eliza hadn't. "Cole Brennan, the Double B Ranch. Martha waited for the name to land, which it did. Everyone in the territory knew Cole Brennan, or knew of him, which was almost the same thing in a place this size. He owned 11,000 acres south of town, ran more cattle than anyone else in the county, and had a reputation for being fair in business and quiet everywhere else. Eliza had seen him twice, maybe 3 times, once from across the street, once at the bank, once when he'd come into the hotel during breakfast service, and she'd been delivering rolls. A tall man, dark-haired, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he spent as much time working the land as he did owning it. She didn't know him. Didn't have reason to. "He's getting married?" Eliza asked. "First Saturday of November," Martha said. "To some woman from Chicago. Philadelphia, maybe. I can't keep it straight. The point is she's from money, and she's bringing a whole opinion about how things ought to be done." Martha shifted her weight. "He's looking for someone to handle the feast. The cooking, I mean. The whole thing. Ceremony dinner, dancing supper, the cake. 400 guests." Eliza's hand stopped moving. 400. Near enough. It's going to be the biggest event this territory has seen in years. He's trying to impress her people. You know how it goes. Martha's tone was carefully neutral. "I mentioned your name, told him you're the best baker in 3 counties, which is true, and that you'd done the Miller anniversary supper last spring, which I hope you don't mind me saying." "Martha," Eliza pressed her hand flat against the flour sack. "How much is he paying?" Martha told her. Eliza stood very still for a moment. The number Martha had said was sitting in the air between them like something breakable. $60, she said quietly. $60 for the cooking, plus materials covered separate. You'd run the kitchen from the day before through the evening of. He'd house you at the ranch for that time. Martha paused. "There's a condition, though." "What kind of condition?" Martha's expression did something complicated. "The fiancé's condition, not Cole's, from what I understand. She wants the evening to feel," she searched for the word, "seamless. She doesn't want guests to be aware of the working arrangements. So the arrangement would be that you use the back stairs, stay out of the main rooms, don't interact with guests directly." She said it quickly, like pulling a bandage. "You'd be paid in full regardless. The $60 is guaranteed." Eliza looked at her for a long moment. The wind pushed against the side of the store, and somewhere down the street a horse made a sharp sound of objection to something. "She wants me invisible," Eliza said. Not angry, just naming it. Martha didn't look away. "That's about the size of it, yes." The practical part of Eliza's brain, the part that had been running calculations since she walked out of Calloway's bank, was already doing the arithmetic. $60. She owed 43. The remaining 17 would carry her well into January, buy her time, maybe enough time to build back towards something stable. The practical part of her brain didn't care about backstairs. The other part, the part that was still, underneath all the weight of the past 2 years, a person with a name and a history and a mother who had sewn her an apron with her initials on the chest, that part took a small, quiet blow. She breathed through it. "I'll do it," she said. She spent the next 4 days planning. The scope of the job was unlike anything she'd taken on before, and she approached it the way she approached every problem, by breaking it down into parts small enough to be manageable, and then working through each one in order. She filled 3 pages of her household ledger with lists, quantities, sequences, timing, substitutions for ingredients she might not be able to source locally. She wrote out the full menu twice, first as she imagined it, and then as it would actually be, pruning the impractical and shoring up the gaps. The wedding feast would need to serve 400 people across 2 sittings, the formal dinner following the ceremony, and the lighter supper for the dancing that would go until midnight. The dinner required 8 dishes plus bread. The supper required 4. And then the cake. The cake was the thing that kept her awake. She had made wedding cakes before, a 2-tier for the Miller anniversary, a single tier for the Harmon girls' wedding in the spring. But this was different. Madeline Pierce, the fiancée, had sent specifications through an intermediary. 3 tiers, white fondant finish, sugar flowers, specifically roses and lily of the valley, a height of no less than 24 inches. Eliza had stared at those specifications for a long time. Then she had taken out her drawing pencil and started sketching. The structural challenge alone was significant. A three-tier cake of that height would require internal supports, wooden dowels carefully placed, or the upper tiers would compress the lower ones into collapse. The fondant would need to be applied in sections, smoothed with a method she'd read about in a baking manual, but never attempted. The sugar flours would take at least 6 hours of work, possibly more. And all of this would need to happen in a kitchen she'd never worked in before, using an oven she didn't know the temperament of. She found herself both dreading it and wanting it the way she hadn't wanted anything in a long time. The desire to solve a hard problem was something she recognized in herself. It was one of the few things that made her feel, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, like herself. She arrived at the Double B Ranch on a Friday morning, the day before the wedding, with her supplies loaded in a borrowed wagon and a list in her apron pocket. The ranch was bigger up close than it looked from the road. The main house was 3 stories of white-painted timber with a covered porch running its full length, and behind it the kitchen building sat separate. A smart arrangement, keeping cooking smells and fire risk at a remove from the living quarters. The outbuildings stretched away toward the south, bunkhouses and barns and equipment sheds in various states of maintenance. Everything was well kept without being ostentatious. It was the property of a man who used what he had. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Agnes, who wore her gray hair in a knot that seemed to defy gravity, met Eliza at the kitchen door with a look that was not unkind but was not warm either. Professional, Eliza decided. That was fine. "Mrs. Mercer," Agnes said, "I'll show you where things are." The kitchen was large and well equipped, better than Eliza had hoped. 2 cast iron stoves, both in good condition. A long center table of thick-cut pine. Shelves organized with the kind of deliberateness that suggested Agnes had been running this space for years. Copper pots hung on ceiling hooks. A separate cold larder opened off the back wall. "The pantry's through there," Agnes said, pointing. "Mr. Brennan had the supplies you requested brought in yesterday. You'll find everything on your list, and if something's missing, Frank Greer will do a run to town before noon." Eliza moved through the kitchen slowly, opening doors, testing the stove draft, getting a sense of the space. She asked 3 questions: where the extra bowls were kept, whether the oven ran hot or cold, Agnes said cold, by about 15 degrees, information Eliza filed immediately, and what time the guests would begin arriving the next day. "Ceremony at 2, Agnes said. "Dinner at 4. The dancing starts at 7 and goes until Mr. Brennan calls it." "I'll need the kitchen to myself tonight," Eliza said. "The cake layers need to bake this evening and set overnight." Agnes looked at her for a moment, reading something, and then nodded. "I'll make sure of it." She worked through the night. This was not unusual for her. She had always been a night worker, had always found something clarifying about the hours when the rest of the world was asleep, and the only sounds were the ones she was making herself. She lit every lamp in the kitchen and set the stoves to the temperatures she needed and began. The cake layers first. She had designed a schedule backward from service time. Everything had its sequence, and the cake anchored the whole structure because it needed the most time. She mixed 6 batches of batter, each with the careful precision she'd been practicing since she was 10 years old, learning beside her mother in a much smaller kitchen in Missouri. Vanilla and almond extract. The good butter Agnes had stocked, which was better than anything she could afford at home. She filled the pans by weight, not volume, a habit Thomas had once teased her about until she'd explained that volume was inconsistent and weight was the truth of the thing. While the first layers baked, she started on the brines and marinades for the following day's meat. 2 haunches of beef needed to spend the night in a spiced salt brine. The duck breasts needed an herb rub. These things couldn't be hurried, and she had learned long ago that the invisible work, the work no guest ever saw or thought about, was usually the work that made everything else possible. She was pulling the first cake layers from the oven, her face hot from the stove, her arms aching pleasantly from hours of mixing, when she heard a floorboard creak behind her. She turned. Cole Brennan was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was wearing trousers and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, his hair slightly disordered in the way of a man who had been awake for too long rather than one who had just gotten up. He was holding a coffee cup that was empty, which suggested he'd come looking for the pot rather than specifically for her. They looked at each other for a moment. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. Then, seeming to realize the hour, "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was still up. I just wanted to—" He held up the cup, which covered the sentence's ending adequately. "The coffee's on the back burner," Eliza said. She had made a fresh pot 40 minutes ago for herself. It's strong. That's fine. He came in, found the pot, poured carefully, and then stood with the cup and looked at the kitchen. Really looked at it. She watched him take in the organized chaos of the space, the cooling cake layers on their racks, the lined-up bowls with their resting doughs, the neat stacks of prepared ingredients with their small labels. "You've been at this all night," he said. Not a question. "Started around 6 this evening," she said. "I'll keep going until about 4, then sleep a few hours, then start the morning prep." He turned the cup in his hands. "Agnes said you came with a plan written down, that you had everything." He made a gesture that seemed to indicate a level of organizational specificity he hadn't encountered before. "If you don't know what order things need to happen, you end up doing them in the wrong order," Eliza said. "For an event this size, the wrong order means something fails." He nodded slowly. "What's failing proof?" She looked at him for a moment, assessing whether the question was genuine curiosity or polite conversation. His face suggested genuine. "Nothing is failing proof," she said. "But if I do the long timeline things first, said brines, cake layers, stock for the sauces, then the short timeline things have something to stand on. The risk moves from catastrophic to manageable." Cole Brennan looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not pity, which she would have resented. Something more like recognition. The look of someone who understood risk management from a different field. "Same thing with cattle in a storm," he said. "You can't stop the weather, but if the windbreaks are up before it hits, the loss is different." Eliza almost smiled. "Yes, that's about right." He stood in her kitchen for another 5 minutes, drinking his coffee and not bothering her with conversation, which, she found, she didn't mind. There was a quality to his silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Not the heavy silence of a man with an agenda, but the simple silence of someone who was tired and didn't feel the need to fill the air. When he set the cup in the basin and said goodnight, she said goodnight back. And then he was gone, and she was alone again with her cake layers and her lists and the sound of the stoves doing their patient, necessary work. She stood in the warm kitchen for a moment after he left. Then she picked up her pastry brush and went back to work. The morning of the wedding came in cold and clear, the sky the hard blue of late autumn when all the softness has been stripped out of it by the first real frosts. By 7, Eliza had been working for 3 hours, and the kitchen smelled of roasting beef and brown butter and something sweet beneath it all from the sugar work she'd begun on the cake flours. She had not slept well. 4 hours on the narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen, which Agnes had set up for her with clean sheets and a wool blanket, and a considerateness that Eliza appreciated more than she'd have known how to say. But her mind had kept circling the sequence, checking and rechecking the timing, running through the contingencies, cataloging what could still go wrong. The fondant, the upper tier supports, the duck, which needed to be pulled at exactly the right moment or the texture would be wrong. She was pressing the first sheet of fondant when she heard the door open and Cole Brennan came in again with his coffee cup. "Good morning," he said, and his voice had the slightly roughened quality of someone who hadn't slept much either. "There's a fresh pot," Eliza said. "Same place." He poured, leaned against the counter, and watched her work for a moment. She was aware of being watched, which was not her natural preference, but something about his attention was different from the kind of attention that made her want to step behind a door. He wasn't watching with the expectation of being entertained. He was watching the way you watched something that you respected and were trying to understand. "Those are for the cake," he said, nodding at the sugar flowers drying on their rack. "Yes, they need 6 hours minimum to set hard enough to place." He came closer, studying them without touching. They were not finished yet. She still needed to add the detail work to the rose petals, the fine veining on the lily-of-the-valley leaves, but even at this stage they were clearly good, better than good. "You made these by hand," he said. "Everything on that cake will be made by hand." He was quiet for a moment. "Madeline's going to—" He stopped, started again. "The guests are going to be impressed." Eliza noticed the correction, but didn't comment on it. She kept her eyes on the fondant. "Mr. Brennan," she said carefully, "I wanted to confirm the arrangement so there aren't misunderstandings this evening. I'll use the service stairs throughout. I won't address guests directly. If something needs to be communicated about the food, Agnes is the person to speak to." She kept her tone even, businesslike, as if she were reciting terms of trade. "That was the agreement." Something shifted in his expression. It was brief, a tightening, maybe, around the eyes, and then it was gone. Yes, he said. That's what was agreed. He said it in a tone that suggested the sentence tasted slightly wrong in his mouth, but he said it, and that was that. And she nodded and went back to the fondant. After he left, she stood for a moment with her hands still. Then she squared her shoulders and went back to work. By noon, the kitchen was operating at a pitch of organized urgency that Eliza had orchestrated with a precision that Agnes, moving in and out with supplies and updates, watched with an expression hovering somewhere between admiration and mild disbelief. 3 kitchen helpers had been hired for the day. Local women Agnes had brought in, competent and quiet and willing to follow direction. Eliza had briefed them early in the morning with the same brisk efficiency she used for everything. Here is what we are doing. Here is the order we are doing it in. Here is what to do if something goes wrong. No flourishes, no warmth that she couldn't afford to spend. Clara, the youngest of the 3, maybe 19, was assigned to the bread. Eliza had shown her the folding technique 3 times until she had it right, and then left her to it, which Clara had seemed to take as a compliment. Ruth handled the vegetable prep with the speed of someone who had done nothing but vegetable prep for 20 years, which appeared to be exactly the case. And Margaret, who had the calm demeanor of someone not easily rattled, was given the sauces with instructions to stir and never to rush. The main dishes were coming together. The beef haunches came out of their brines and went onto the spits with a complexity of spices that Eliza had worked out over several trial runs at home. The duck breasts were resting before their final hour. 3 different potato preparations, roasted with herbs, mashed with cream, and a gratin she'd improvised from ingredients she found in the larder, were advancing through their stages. The cake stood on its work table in the corner, under a clean cloth, waiting for its final hour of decoration. From the main house, even through the walls and the distance between buildings, she could hear the arriving carriages, the rising volume of voices, the indistinct but unmistakable sound of a social occasion assembling itself. Guests from St. Louis, from Kansas City, from Chicago, she'd been told, which was where Madeline Pierce came from and where many of her family apparently still lived. People who knew what good food tasted like. People who would know, immediately and without sentimentality, if something was wrong. Eliza found that thought clarifying rather than frightening. She had always preferred honest judgment to polite indifference. Just before 2, when the ceremony would be beginning in the main house parlor, Cole Brennan appeared in the kitchen doorway one more time. He was dressed for this occasion now. Dark suit, white shirt, his hair combed with an effort that hadn't been there in the mornings. He looked like a man about to get married, which he was, and there was something in his face that Eliza noticed briefly and then chose not to examine, a quality that was not exactly what you expected to see on a man's face on his wedding day. He looked at the kitchen, at the precise choreography of it, at the workers moving through their tasks, at Eliza standing in the center of all of it with flour on her forearms and her mother's initials on her apron chest. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "you should be getting to the parlor." "I know." He didn't move for a second. Then, "Everything looks—" He stopped. "Thank you. For all of this." She looked at him steadily. "I'm being paid," she said. "Don't thank me for that." Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. He nodded once. Then he went to get married. Well, the food went out at 4, and it was perfect. Not because nothing went wrong. The gravy for the beef thickened too fast, and she had to thin it with stock and adjust. One of the bread baskets wasn't refilled fast enough in the first 20 minutes, and she corrected that sharply, and the duck had come out of the oven 3 minutes later than she'd wanted, which put pressure on the rest of the timing. But because she had planned for those gaps, had built in the margins, had made sure that by the time any given thing arrived at the table, it was as close to right as she could get it. She knew this because Agnes came back to the kitchen twice to report, without being asked, that the dining room guests were doing things justice, which was Agnes's way of saying the food was being received with genuine pleasure rather than polite acceptance. And once, through the window that looked out toward the side lawn, where some of the overflow guests were seated, Eliza saw a woman in a blue dress put down her fork, look at the person across from her, and say something that made them both laugh. Not the social laugh of people being polite, but the real one. and she knew from the timing of it and the way the woman touched her mouth after that it was about the food. She let herself feel that for about 10 seconds. Then she went back to the cake. The final decorations had to go on with precision. The sugar roses, 23 of them, in varying stages of bloom because a real garden had roses in varying stages, were placed according to the sketch she had made 2 days ago. The lily of the valley cascades down the sides of the second tier, a trailing ribbon of sugar leaves connecting them. And at the base of each tier, a border of tiny repeated blossoms that had taken her 4 hours to pipe and had been entirely invisible to anyone who didn't look carefully, which meant they were invisible to most people, which meant she had done them entirely for herself. She stepped back and looked at it. It was the best thing she had ever made, not because it was the most technically difficult, though it was that, but because it was the fullest expression of what she knew how to do, assembled under pressure, for an occasion that didn't know she existed, which was fine. The quality of the thing didn't depend on whether anyone knew who had made it. The roses were real, whether or not anyone knew her name. Agnes came to the kitchen door. "They're ready for the cake." Eliza untied her apron, smoothed it, retied it. "Let's go," she said. She carried the bottom tier herself, which was the heaviest and the most critical. If the base was unstable, everything above it would be at risk. Clara carried the second tier, following Eliza's exact instructions about angle and speed. Ruth carried the third, and Margaret walked alongside with the stand and the final small box of spare flowers for any last-minute repairs. They went up the back stairs, through the service corridor, to the side entrance of the main dining hall. From her position beside the service door, Eliza could see a slice of the hall through the gap. The long tables with their white linens, the candles lit now in the early evening dark, the guests in their fine clothes, the sound of voices, and the particular warmth of a room full of people who have eaten well and drunk moderately and are in that pleasant state of goodwill that a good dinner produces. She assembled the cake on its stand with hands that were steady, checked the tiers, adjusted one of the roses by a 1/4 inch, stepped back. Then she went back down the service stairs, back into the kitchen, and began the quiet work of preparing the supper dishes for the evening. From somewhere above her, she heard the sound of the hall when they brought the cake out. It was not polite applause. It was the spontaneous sound of 400 people encountering something unexpected. A genuine collective intake and release, the real thing, not the performance of it. Eliza stood in the kitchen and heard it and felt something in her chest that she couldn't name. Pride and grief and something else, something quieter. A recognition that this mattered to her more than she'd let herself admit. She stood with that feeling for exactly as long as it took to take one full breath. Then she picked up her ladle and got back to work. She was good at that, at getting back to work. It was, she had come to understand over the past 2 years, the most reliable thing about her. The hall above her hummed with voices and music, and she worked in the light of the kitchen lamps, and nobody came to tell her she had done well, and that was exactly what she had agreed to. It was fine. But somewhere behind her practical, squared-off acceptance of the arrangement, behind the part of her that knew this was a transaction, and nothing more, somewhere in the quiet that she tried not to listen to too closely, something had shifted. She didn't know yet what it meant. She only knew the cake was perfect, and the food was gone. And somewhere upstairs a room full of strangers were full and happy, and had no idea whose hands had made it possible. And that Cole Brennan had said thank you with an expression that suggested he meant something larger than the word, and that she had told him not to. She scraped down the mixing bowl, rinsed the ladle, checked the clock. 2 more hours until supper service. She got back to work. The supper dishes went out at 7:30, right as the fiddle player in the main hall struck up the first dancing tune, and by 8 o'clock, Eliza had the kitchen running on its final hour of real work. The heavy lifting was done. What remained was maintenance, keeping the platters replenished, the bread warm, the small savory pies coming out in rotation so that the late-night guests always found something fresh rather than something that had been sitting since the first service. Clara and Ruth were managing the replenishment well enough without close supervision. Margaret had gone home at 7 with her wages and a quiet nod that Eliza recognized as the professional's version of a compliment, the acknowledgement that working alongside someone competent was its own reward. Agnes moved between the kitchen and the hall with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 20 years, which she had, and whose opinion of Eliza had shifted over the course of the day from professional neutrality to something warmer, though neither of them had commented on it directly. Eliza stood at the center work table and let herself feel tired for the first time. Not the bone-deep exhaustion that had been her constant companion since Thomas died. That was a different kind of tired. The kind that sleep didn't fix because it wasn't really about sleep. This was the clean tiredness of a body that had done what it was asked to do and done it well. Her back ached from 16 hours on her feet. Her hands were rough from the fondant work and the cold water she'd been washing them in all day. Her apron was marked with a half-dozen small evidence points of everything the day had required. A smear of duck fat near the hem, a faint ghost of powdered sugar across the chest, the slight darkening at the pocket where she kept her pencil. She was pouring herself a cup of coffee when she heard the hall door open somewhere above her and footsteps on the back stairs. She assumed it was Agnes with a replenishment request. But when the kitchen door opened, it was Cole Brennan, still in his wedding suit, with his jacket slightly open and the expression of a man who had been shaking hands and accepting congratulations for 4 hours and needed about 30 seconds of not doing that. Eliza set down her cup. He looked at the kitchen, at the organized wind down of it, the cleaned surfaces, the pots soaking, the remaining trays laid out with their careful arrangements, and something in his posture shifted, not relaxed exactly, but relieved of some particular tension. "Is there coffee?" he asked. "Back burner," she said. "Same as always." He almost smiled at "same as always," which had only been 2 mornings, but she understood what it meant. The small geography of a space becoming familiar through repetition, the comfort of knowing where things were. He poured his cup and leaned against the counter, and for a moment neither of them said anything. From above them, the fiddle picked up pace. Someone laughed, a woman, sharp and bright, and the sound floated down through the floorboards like a rumor. "The cake," he said finally. "I heard the room when they brought it out." "I heard it too," Eliza said, "from down here." He looked at her then, and it was the same look as the night before, the one she couldn't quite categorize. "How does that feel?" "Hearing it from down here." She picked up her coffee cup. "Like I did my job." "That's not an answer." She considered him for a moment. He wasn't wrong, and she found she didn't have the energy at the end of this day to perform the particular kind of acceptance she'd been performing since she arrived. "It's the answer I've got," she said. "The other answer isn't useful." He nodded slowly, like someone filing that away. "Fair enough." The silence between them was the same as the night before, not empty, not pressured. She'd been alone so much in the past 2 years that she'd become finely calibrated to the quality of other people's presence, the way you became sensitive to temperature after spending too long in the cold. Some people's silence was an expectation in disguise. His wasn't. "The beef," he said. "The spice on the brine. What was that?" She looked at him. "You want to know about the brine? I've had beef 100 ways on this ranch. That was different." She set down her cup. "Juniper berries. Black pepper, bay, the usual. But I added dried sour cherry and a small amount of molasses to the brine. It pulls the flavor in a different direction. Keeps the meat from tasting flat after long roasting." He turned the information over. "Sour cherry. It's not obvious, which is the point. You taste the beef, not the brine. The brine is just doing work underneath." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had shifted into something more direct. "Where'd you learn that?" "My mother. And then years of getting it wrong before I got it right." She paused. "The first time I tried the cherry brine, I used too much, and the meat tasted like a pie filling." Thomas couldn't stop laughing. She hadn't meant to say that. The name had come out before she'd decided to let it. She picked up a cloth and wiped down the already clean counter. Cole didn't push on the name. "Thomas was your husband." "Yes." "Agnes mentioned. I'm sorry." "Thank you." The words were automatic, worn smooth by repetition. Then, because something about the directness of this particular conversation made the automatic feel insufficient. "It was 2 years ago this February. Fever. 3 days from fine to gone." She kept her voice even. "You don't get ready for that." "No," he said, "you don't." Something in the way he said it suggested he wasn't speaking entirely generally, but she didn't ask and he didn't elaborate, and they let it sit between them like something that didn't need to be handled. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup himself, which she noticed because it was not what she expected, and set it in the basin. "The supper trays are running low on the small pies," she said. "Clara will have the next round out in about 10 minutes, but someone should let Agnes know to expect them." I'll tell her on my way back. He picked up his jacket from where he'd laid it over a chair and then stopped. Mrs. Mercer, the guests tonight, a lot of them were asking about the food. Who was responsible for it? He looked at her steadily. Agnes told them it was handled by the ranch. Eliza held his gaze. That's fine. It's not, actually. The words came out flat and honest. But I understand why the arrangement was what it was, and He stopped. I should get back. Yes, she said. You should. He left, and she listened to his steps on the back stairs, and then she picked up her cloth again and continued wiping down the counter that was already clean. It was fine, she told herself. She just wished she believed it the way she used to. The dancing ran until nearly midnight. The kitchen wound down by 10:30, and Eliza sent Clara and Ruth home with their wages and her genuine thanks. She stayed to finish the cleanup herself. She always stayed for the cleanup, partly from habit and partly because she couldn't leave a kitchen in disorder. It wasn't in her nature. The same way she couldn't leave a crooked picture on a wall without straightening it. By 11, she had the kitchen as close to its original condition as she could get it in one night. Everything washed and put away. The stoves banked for the night, the surfaces clean. She sat at the center table with her cold coffee and her list, drawing a line through the last item, and let the silence of the late kitchen settle around her. $60, she thought. She had earned it. She would go to the bank on Monday. She would walk in and put the money on Calloway's desk and watch his expression recalibrate, and it would feel like something she wasn't quite ready to name, but suspected was close to dignity. She folded her list and put it in her apron pocket and went to bed. She was asleep within 5 minutes, which was the fastest she'd fallen asleep in, longer than she could remember. She didn't hear the last of the carriages leaving. She didn't hear the hall go quiet. She slept the way you slept when a hard thing was over and you had come through it intact. And if she dreamed, she didn't remember what about. The next morning, she woke to gray light through the small window and the smell of coffee already made. When she came into the kitchen, Agnes was at the stove, and there was a plate of bread and fried eggs on the table. And Agnes said, without turning around, "Sit down and eat before you start thinking about cleaning anything else. It's Sunday." Eliza sat down. She ate the eggs, which were good, and the bread, which was not as good as hers but was hot, and she was hungry enough that the comparison was academic. Agnes sat down across from her with her own plate, which was unusual enough, a housekeeper sitting to breakfast with a hired cook, that Eliza looked at her directly. "You did good work yesterday," Agnes said, "in case nobody's said it plainly enough." Eliza looked down at her plate. "Thank you. I've been running this kitchen for 16 years, Agnes said. "I've seen what it takes to put out a supper for 40 people. Yesterday was 10 times that, and you didn't lose your head once." She picked up her fork. "That's not nothing." "No," Eliza said, "it isn't." They ate in the comfortable quiet of two working women who had no need to fill the space, and the gray morning light came through the window and lay across the table between them. She had planned to collect her wages and leave after breakfast. That had been her intention since the night before: clean, efficient, no prolonged goodbyes. But Agnes told her that Cole was out with the morning hands until at least 10, and the wages would come from him directly, which was his custom, so she had 2 hours to fill. She used them in the kitchen, which was the only way she knew to use unexpected time. She restocked the bread for the ranch hand's breakfast, reorganized the spice shelf that had gotten slightly disordered during the day's work, and found herself, without quite deciding to, working on a batch of cinnamon rolls that nobody had asked for and that wouldn't be on anyone's inventory. She was pulling them from the oven when she heard boots on the back steps. Cole came in with the smell of cold air and horses and hay on him, his hat in his hand, his hair wind disordered. He looked at the cinnamon rolls, then at her. "You don't have to keep working," he said. "I wasn't working," she said, which was not entirely true. "I was thinking, and this is what I do when I'm thinking." He came to the table and sat down with the directness of a man who had been outdoors for hours and was willing to be in a warm kitchen for a few minutes without apologizing for it. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at him steadily. "Going to the bank Monday morning?" He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope and set it on the table. "Your wages." She picked it up, opened the flap, looked at the bills inside. $60, as agreed. She folded the envelope and put it in her apron pocket and felt the weight of it there, the small, solid fact of it. "There's something else," Cole said. She looked at him. The guest last night. I had 3 different conversations before midnight with people who wanted to know who had done the cooking. I told them all that the arrangement was private. He paused. But one of them was Samuel Holt. She knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Samuel Holt ran the largest cattle operation in the county, was on the board of the Territorial Bank alongside 3 other men whose combined influence touched most of what happened economically in the region. He was also, she recalled, building a new house outside of town and was known for entertaining extravagantly. He wants to talk to you about catering his Christmas dinner, Cole said. 40 guests, private event, good wage. I told him I'd pass the message along. Eliza sat with that for a moment. Why did you tell him private? She asked. Cole looked at her evenly. Because it wasn't my business to tell him otherwise. She understood what he meant. The arrangement, her arrangement, the one she had agreed to, had kept her name out of the evening. He had honored that. And at the same time, he had not used that arrangement to take credit for something she had done, had simply declined to discuss it rather than redirect the credit elsewhere. It was a careful line to walk, and he had walked it without fanfare. She wasn't sure yet what to do with a man who was careful about things like that. The Christmas dinner, she said. What wage? He didn't specify, but Holt doesn't underpay for things he cares about. A pause. And he clearly cared about that food. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and stood to refill it, mostly because she needed something to do with her hands while she thought. She poured, came back to the table, sat down. I'll need to speak with him directly, she said. Terms and timeline before I commit to anything. I told him that, Cole said. He said he'd expect no less. She looked at him. You told him that before I agreed. The corner of his mouth moved. I figured you'd say it eventually. She didn't smile back, not quite, but something shifted in the set of her shoulders. Some small release of a tension she'd been holding since she arrived at this ranch 2 days ago, with her wagon and her lists, and the carefully maintained boundary between herself and the circumstances of this arrangement. Mr. Brennan, she said. Cole, he said. If you don't mind, you've been in my kitchen for 2 days and you've called me Mr. Brennan every time, which is starting to feel... He stopped, seemed to decide the sentence wasn't going anywhere useful. It's the appropriate form of address, she said. For a guest, maybe. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I don't know what the appropriate form of address is for the person who saved my wedding feast and taught me something about brine that I'm going to be thinking about for a while. Eliza, she said after a moment. Cole, he said. They sat with the cinnamon rolls between them and the quiet kitchen around them, and for a few minutes they talked. Not about the feast or the wedding or the bank or the mortgage, but about smaller things. He asked about Red Hollow when she'd first arrived, and she told him about the way the town had felt in her first winter, vast and indifferent and cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. He told her about the land to the south, the way the grass ran in October, the particular light on the creek bottom at dusk when the cattle were moving. Neither of them was performing anything. They were just talking, the way people talked when they didn't have a reason not to. She noticed that he laughed at something she said, a dry observation about the relative honesty of cattle versus the people she'd sold bread to for 3 years, and that it was a real laugh, the kind that surprised him slightly. She noticed that he refilled her coffee without asking. She noticed, and then she put it away carefully into the same part of herself where she kept the sound of the hall when they'd brought out the cake. When he stood to go, he took 2 of the cinnamon rolls, which she had not offered and he had not asked about, and she found she didn't mind. I'll give Holt your message, he said, that you'll want to speak to him directly before agreeing to anything. Thank you. He put on his hat at the door and stopped. Eliza. She looked at him. The arrangement yesterday, he said, and his voice had gone to a quieter register. The back stairs and all of it. I know it was agreed to. I know you accepted it. He held her gaze. But I want you to know I'm not comfortable with it, and I should have said so before you agreed. She was quiet for a moment. You're saying it now, she said. Too late to matter. Maybe not, she said, and didn't explain what she meant by that, and he nodded once and went out the kitchen door, and she listened to his steps crossing the yard, and then she was alone in the kitchen again with the smell of cinnamon and the envelope of $60 in her apron pocket. She sat at the table for a while. She thought about the mortgage and the bank and the hard arithmetic of her life, which was what she always thought about, what she had trained herself to think about because it was useful and concrete and demanded nothing from her emotionally. And then, despite herself, she thought about the way he'd refilled her coffee without asking. Small thing. Barely a thing at all. She stood, put on her coat, loaded her empty crates back into the wagon she'd arranged to have left at the kitchen door. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of day that made the brown grass and bare trees look deliberate rather than depleted, like someone had chosen this palette on purpose. She drove back toward Red Hollow along the southern road, the horse moving at its patient pace, the wagon creaking in the familiar way she'd stopped noticing years ago. The town appeared in the middle distance, small against the flat land and the wide sky, its buildings clustered together like people standing close for warmth. Her cottage was cold when she got back. She built the fire, put on the kettle, sat at her kitchen table with her ledger and wrote down the $60 in the income column and the $43.16 in the expense column and drew a line and did the arithmetic, which came out to $16.84 remaining, which was the most she'd had left after expenses in 2 years. She stared at the number. Then she closed the ledger, picked up her pencil, and opened the battered baking notebook she kept separate from the household accounts. The one with the recipes and the notes and the small sketches of cake designs and the margin annotations in her own cramped handwriting. She turned to a blank page. At the top she wrote, Holt Christmas Dinner, Terms to Discuss. Below that she wrote, 3-tier cake, full decorative treatment. Note, Lily of the Valley holds better than rose in dry indoor air. And then, at the bottom of the page, without quite knowing why, she wrote, Sour cherry brine. He noticed. She looked at that last line for a moment. Then she put the notebook away and went to start the next morning's bread. The dough was cool and resistant under her hands at first, the way it always was in cold weather, needing more working than it would in summer, the yeast slower to wake. She kneaded it with the practiced rhythm she'd had since childhood. Weight through the heel of her hand, fold and turn, the dough gradually warming and becoming cooperative, the resistance giving way to something that moved with her instead of against her. She thought about the Christmas dinner. 40 guests was manageable. If Holt paid what the work was worth, it could cover January and February. If the word spread from there, and in a territory this size, word always spread, there might be other events, spring weddings, summer gatherings, the kind of steady, accumulating work that could turn a precarious situation into something that resembled stability. She thought about how 2 days ago she had arrived at Cole Brennan's ranch feeling like a woman who had agreed to disappear and was leaving it feeling something she didn't quite have a word for yet. Not hope, exactly. Something more cautious than hope. But something. The dough was ready. She covered it and left it to rise and stood at her kitchen window looking out at her small yard. The bare vegetable garden. The woodpile she'd stacked in September that was already lower than she wanted it to be. The winter was long still. There was a lot of hard work ahead of her, the same as always. But $60 was in her apron pocket. Her name was worth something in this territory now, whether anyone had said it aloud at that wedding or not. And somewhere south of town, a man had noticed what was underneath the brine, which was the part that did the actual work, the part that you weren't supposed to see. She turned away from the window. There was bread to make. There was always bread to make, and she was good at it, and that, for now, was enough. The Holt Christmas dinner came and went in December, and it went well. Well enough that Samuel Holt pressed an extra $5 into her hand at the end of the evening and said, with the blunt sincerity of a man unaccustomed to being surprised, that he hadn't eaten food like that since a trip to St. Louis 4 years ago. Eliza thanked him, loaded her crates, and drove home through a light snowfall with the kind of quiet satisfaction she had learned not to speak aloud, as if naming it might disturb it. January was hard, the way January always was. The cold descended past the point where it was merely inconvenient and became something you had to actively manage, and the bread deliveries became shorter because fewer people were moving through town, and those who were had less to spend. But she was not behind anymore. The mortgage was current. The woodpile held. She worked through the short days and the long nights with the same methodical persistence that had gotten her through every other January, and she did not let herself think too far ahead, which was a discipline she had gotten very good at. Cole Brennan came to buy bread on a Tuesday in the middle of January. She was at the delivery window of the cottage when she saw him coming up the path, which surprised her. The Double B Ranch had its own supply arrangements, and she had not heard from him since the morning after the wedding when she'd collected her wages. She had thought about him more than she'd intended to over the past 6 weeks, in the way that a person sometimes finds an unexpected conversation returning at odd moments, the way a word you've read once keeps appearing in other texts. She opened the window. "I didn't know you did deliveries to town," she said. "I don't usually." He stopped at the window with his hat in his hand, and there was something slightly awkward in his posture. The stance of a man who had prepared what he wanted to say and was now finding that preparation insufficient. "I was in town for business. Agnes mentioned you sold bread from the cottage on Tuesdays." "I do." She looked at him. "What kind would you like?" He looked at the bread and then back at her. "Whatever you think is best." She wrapped 2 loaves of the sourdough rye and a small pan of the cornbread and told him the price, which he paid without comment, and then he stood there for a moment holding the bread with the expression of a man who had come for a reason that wasn't bread. "Samuel Holt spoke well of you," he said, apparently to everyone he encountered in December. "That was kind of him. He told me you refused to let him call you by your first name until the 2nd hour of the evening." A pause. "He seemed to find that respectful," he called it. "It's a professional habit," she said. "He also said you corrected his kitchen staff twice without raising your voice, and both times they thanked you for it afterward." Cole shifted the bread under his arm. "He said that was unusual." She looked at him evenly. "Was there something else you needed, Mr. Brennan?" He took a breath. "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to handle the Spring Cattle Association dinner. It's in March. 45 guests, formal supper, held at the Territorial Hotel. I'm on the organizing committee this year." He paused. "I told them I knew someone." She considered him for a moment. "What does the committee know about the person you know?" "That she's the best cook in the territory, and she doesn't work for anyone's convenience but her own." Something shifted in her expression, very slightly. "That's a generous characterization." "It's an accurate one." He met her eyes. "The wage would be fair. You'd have full menu authority. I told them that was non-negotiable." The phrase landed in her chest with a specific weight. Non-negotiable. She thought about back stairs and service corridors and the sound of a hall she'd heard from underneath. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He settled his hat back on. "The bread smells good." "It usually does," she said, and closed the window. She stood at the center of her kitchen for a long moment after his footsteps had faded down the path. Then she picked up her pencil and opened her baking notebook and wrote at the top of a new page, "March Cattle Association Dinner. Full menu authority." She underlined the last 3 words. The winter moved through February and into a March that came in with cold rain rather than snow, which felt like progress even when the mud it produced made every errand twice as difficult. She did the Cattle Association dinner, and it was good. Not as ambitious as the wedding feast, but solid and well-received. And she was introduced before the meal as the event's caterer, her name said aloud into a room of 45 people, none of whom looked at her with anything but interest. She ate the moment quietly, in the way she'd learned to eat the moments that mattered, without making too much of them, without letting herself need them too badly, but not wasting them either. Cole sat at the head table and did not look at her when she was introduced, which she understood. There was a care in his not looking that was considerate rather than dismissive, an awareness of the line between professional acknowledgement and something that could be misconstrued. She understood it and appreciated it, and also noticed it more than she expected to. By April, they had established an irregular pattern that neither of them named or discussed directly. He came to the Tuesday window most weeks now, sometimes with specific requests, and sometimes with the transparent pretense of needing bread from a woman who lived 2 miles from his ranch. They talked through the delivery window for longer than was strictly necessary for a bread transaction. About the land, about the weather, about the small mechanics of running operations, hers domestic, his agricultural, both of them fundamentally the same problem: how to make a hard thing work with limited margin for error. One Tuesday in late April, she told him about the October she and Thomas had arrived in Red Hollow, the wagon breaking an axle 3 miles outside of town, both of them sitting in the road with everything they owned in a tilted pile, Thomas starting to laugh about it before she did, which had irritated her at the time and was now, in retrospect, one of the things she missed most about him specifically. Cole was quiet for a moment after she told it. Then he said, My wife died 6 years ago. Eleanor. Fever, same as Thomas. He said it the way she'd said Thomas's name the first time. Not planned, not performed, just coming out because the context called for it. She liked this particular smell of spring, that first real warm day. I still notice it every year. Eliza didn't say she was sorry. They'd both had enough sorries. She said, what else did she like? And he told her, there at the delivery window with the April wind moving the new grass in the yard behind her, and she listened with the full attention she gave to things that mattered. She didn't know what this was yet. She was not a woman who let herself reach conclusions before the evidence supported them, and the evidence here was careful and slow-moving and could be read in more than one way. What she knew was that on Tuesday morning she found herself checking the time more than usual. What she knew was that the conversation felt different from every other conversation she'd had in 2 years. What she knew was that she was not sure what to do with knowing those things. She kept her hands in the work. There was always work. She kept her expectations modest and her ledger current and her notebook full of new ideas for dishes she hadn't tried yet, and she let the weeks accumulate without forcing them toward any particular conclusion. And then May arrived, and with it, a letter. It came in the regular mail packet from the post office, in an envelope with no return address, but the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar and precise, in a way that suggested education and a certain self-consciousness about it. She opened it at her kitchen table with her morning coffee. It was from Madeline Pierce, or rather, the name at the bottom was Madeline Brennan now, which produced a specific complicated sensation in Eliza's chest that she did not examine in detail. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first informed her that Madeline would be hosting a celebration of her arrival in the territory in early November, a large gathering of her husband's associates and her own family visiting from the east, and had heard that Eliza Mercer was available for catering work. The second paragraph outlined the scale: 400 guests, a formal dinner and dancing supper, a wedding anniversary cake. The third paragraph contained the terms. Eliza read the terms twice. They were, in several respects, more generous than the original wedding arrangement. The wage offered was $80, $20 more than the first time. The kitchen authority was complete. There was one other condition stated in the third paragraph in Madeline's precise handwriting, and Eliza read it a third time to make sure she was understanding it correctly. Given the nature of the event and our guests' expectations, it would be preferred that service staff remain unobtrusive throughout the evening. As we discussed at our initial arrangement, the cooking arrangements are best kept as a private matter. She put the letter down. She sat with it for a long time. $80. The number was real and significant and mapped directly onto the parts of her life that still required shoring up. By November, the mortgage would be current and the winter supplies handled, but the margin would still be thin. $80 would thicken it considerably. $80 was not a small thing. She picked up the letter and read it one more time. As we discussed at our initial arrangement, they had not discussed it. Eliza had accepted conditions that had been handed to her through an intermediary. She had swallowed something that didn't go down cleanly and had done it because she had no alternative. And the woman who wrote this letter knew that and was offering the same arrangement again with the confidence of someone who had found a formula that worked. Eliza set the letter on the table. She picked up her pencil. She wrote her reply, which was short, and posted it the next morning. She told Madeline Brennan that she was available in November and that the wage was acceptable, and that she had one condition of her own, which was that there would be no prior arrangement regarding her presence or absence from any part of the event. She would manage the kitchen and remain in the kitchen as was standard for catering work. She would not agree in advance to back stairs or service corridors or deliberate invisibility. She signed it Eliza Mercer Red Hollow and sent it without letting herself reconsider. She did not hear back. She assumed the engagement was canceled and put it out of her mind as best she could and focused on the work of summer and early fall, which kept her busy enough that she mostly succeeded. What she did not know, because Cole had not told her and she had not asked, was that Madeline had received the letter and discussed it with Cole, and that Cole had told his wife, with a quietness that had a specific quality to it, that Mrs. Mercer's terms were reasonable, and the engagement should proceed on those terms, or not at all. She found out about this later, much later. At the time, all she knew was that in the second week of September, a brief letter arrived from the ranch confirming her engagement for the first Saturday of November, and stating that the full menu was at her discretion and that Agnes would be available to coordinate logistics. She read it twice. Then she put it with her accounts and started planning. The second time around, the planning felt different. She knew the kitchen, she knew the stoves and their temperaments and where the extra bowls were, and that the draft on the left oven ran slightly cold. She knew Agnes's rhythms and the ranch's supply arrangements and how long it took to move from the kitchen building to the service entrance of the main hall. The logistical unknowns that had made the first event so demanding were gone, replaced by a familiarity that freed her attention for the cooking itself. She spent 3 weeks on the menu, and it was the most ambitious thing she had ever designed. The centerpiece was a slow-roasted bison shoulder she'd been thinking about since August, a preparation she'd worked out through 6 trial runs in her own kitchen, adjusting the spice combination and the roasting time until it did what she needed it to do, which was hold its quality through the 2-hour gap between cooking and service without losing any of the texture that made it worth making. Around it, she built a full architecture of supporting dishes that each had something interesting in them. Not interesting in a way that announced itself, but interesting in the way the cherry brine had been interesting, doing real work underneath. And the cake. For the anniversary cake, she went back to her notebook and started from nothing. Not 3 tiers this time, but 4. Each tier a different flavor, connected by a common design language of autumn botanicals, dried berries, pressed leaves, the small wild asters that grew along the creek bottoms in October. It would be the most technically difficult thing she'd made. She spent a week on the design alone, drawing and discarding and redrawing until she had something she was willing to stand behind. Cole came to the Tuesday window through September and October, and they talked the way they had been talking, and she did not mention the letter or his role in the revised terms because she didn't know about it yet, and he didn't mention it because he was not a man who needed credit for the things he did quietly. The week before the event, she ran into Martha Greer at the dry goods store. Martha was filling a large order and had the distracted energy of someone managing several problems simultaneously, but when she saw Eliza, she stopped. "I heard you're doing the Brennan anniversary party," Martha said. "Yes. People are talking about it." Martha dropped her voice by half a register. "The woman has been in town twice this week. Spent 40 minutes at the hotel talking about the menu with people who weren't involved in planning the menu." She looked at Eliza with an expression that was carefully neutral. "She's told 3 separate people that she personally designed the feast for the wedding last year." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "She told the Miller woman," Martha continued, "that she'd studied with a French chef in Chicago and that the food at her wedding reflected that training." Eliza set down the sack of sugar she'd been holding. "Did she?" "I'm just telling you what I heard." Martha paused. "I thought you should know before you walked into that kitchen." Eliza picked the sugar back up. "Thank you, Martha." She thought about it on the drive home. She sat with it in her kitchen that evening, turning it over, looking at it from different angles the way she looked at a problem in a recipe. Not emotionally, or not only emotionally, but with the part of her brain that assessed and planned. It changed nothing about the work. The food would be what it was going to be regardless of what story Madeline told about it afterward. The quality of the bison roast did not depend on attribution. The cake would be what it was, but something about it settled in her chest at an angle, the way a splinter does. Not debilitating, not the kind of thing that stopped you, but present in a way that reminded you of itself when you moved wrong. She opened her notebook. She looked at the menu she'd spent 3 weeks building. She looked at the cake sketches in the margins, the meticulous notations about timing and temperature and the specific sequence that would make everything possible. She thought about the woman who had written as we discussed about a conversation they had never had. She thought about backstairs and service corridors and the sound of 400 people responding to something they didn't know she'd made. And then she thought about Cole telling her, at the Tuesday window in April, that his wife liked the smell of the first warm spring day and the way he'd said it, plainly, without drama, as an offering of something real. She closed the notebook. She was not going to solve for any of this tonight. Tonight she was going to make bread, same as every night. And tomorrow she was going to keep preparing for an event that would be the best work she had done, because that was what she did. That was the thing nobody could take from her, and nobody could claim credit for. The actual quality of the actual work, which existed independently of every arrangement made around it. She got up and washed her hands and started the dough. On the first Saturday of November, Eliza Mercer drove her wagon back down the road to the Double B Ranch in the cold pre-dawn dark, the supplies stacked behind her, her notebook in her apron pocket, her mother's initials on her chest. The kitchen lights were already on. Agnes had the stoves going and the first supply deliveries arranged along the wall, and she looked at Eliza when she came through the door with the expression of someone who had been looking forward to competent company. "Same as last year?" Agnes asked. "Better," Eliza said, and took off her coat and got to work. By noon, the kitchen was running at full pitch. She had 3 helpers again, different women this time. Agnes had recruited well, and they were quick and steady and followed direction without requiring it twice. The bison's shoulder had gone into the roasting ovens at 5 in the morning and was developing the crust she'd been working toward for 6 weeks, the smell of it filling the kitchen with something rich and complex that made even Agnes pause once and close her eyes briefly. The cake layers were baked and cooling. The autumn botanical decorations were drying on their rack, the pressed asters and the berry clusters she'd spent 3 evenings preparing. The 4-tier structure was assembled on its stand in the corner, waiting for its final decoration, which she would do in the last hour before service. She moved through the kitchen with the focused efficiency of someone who had prepared so thoroughly that the execution had room in it, room to adjust, to respond, to correct the small things that inevitably went sideways, even in the best-run operations. The 2nd-tier cake had a slight lean she caught at 10 o'clock and fixed with an additional dowel before it became a problem. One of the helpers, a young woman named Dora, overworked the potato gratin, and Eliza caught it at 1 o'clock and redirected her with 3 specific instructions that fixed it without humiliating her. The duck sauce needed 1 more reduction than she'd planned. She added 15 minutes to the timeline and adjusted everything downstream without losing pace. At 2 o'clock, Cole came down the back stairs and into the kitchen. He was dressed for the occasion, same dark suit, different shirt, his hair combed with the same imperfect effort she'd noted the year before. He looked at the kitchen with the same expression he'd had the first time, that quality of genuine attention she had never found a word for other than present. "It smells extraordinary," he said. "It should," she said. She was checking the bison's shoulder, pressing a thermometer into the thickest part, watching the number. 90 more minutes on the roast. Everything else is on schedule. He came further into the kitchen and stopped at the work table where the anniversary cake stood in its half-finished state, the botanical decorations beginning to go on, the 4 tiers already suggesting what they would become. He looked at it for a long time. "Eliza," he said quietly. She pulled the thermometer and noted the number. Thank you for coming back." She set down the thermometer and looked at him directly. "You had something to do with me coming back," she said. "The terms." He held her gaze. He didn't deny it. "You should have told me," she said. Not angry, just honest. "I know," he said. "I didn't want you to think I was—" He stopped, looking for the right word. "Managing me," she said. "Yes." A pause. "I just thought the terms were fair, that's all." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly conversational. "They were fair," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and started toward the door, and then stopped. He turned back. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "About Madeline." Eliza waited. "She's been telling people in town that she had a hand in designing the food at the wedding, the menu, the cake." His voice was careful and flat. "I heard about it last week from Frank Greer, and from 2 other people." He met her eyes. "I wanted you to know I'm aware of it. Before tonight." The kitchen was quiet for a moment except for the steady sound of the stoves. Eliza looked at him with an expression she kept very still. "What do you intend to do about it?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I'm not going to pretend it isn't happening." She nodded once, turned back to the cake, picked up the first aster and placed it with steady hands. "Then we'll see," she said. And she went back to work, as she always did, and the kitchen hummed around her, and above them the hall was filling up with 400 people who had no idea what was about to happen. Neither did she. Not yet. The dinner service began at 4, and it was, from the kitchen's perspective, as close to flawless as anything Eliza had managed in her professional life, which meant it had 3 problems she caught before they became visible, and 1 near miss with the gravy boat that Dora recovered from with a speed that earned her a quiet nod of genuine approval. The bison shoulder came out at precisely the moment it needed to, rested its full 20 minutes while the first courses were being cleared, and went to the carving station with a crust that cracked under the knife, the way she'd spent 6 weeks trying to make it crack. From the kitchen, she could hear, in fragments, the sounds of 400 people encountering the food, the particular register of a dining room operating at genuine pleasure rather than social performance. Agnes came back to the kitchen at 5:30 with the expression she'd developed over the past year for delivering information she thought Eliza needed, which was a slight compression of the mouth and a directness of eye contact. "The guests are asking about the menu," Agnes said. "Several of them have come to the serving station wanting to know about the bison preparation." "What are they being told?" Eliza asked. She was plating the third course, her hands moving without pause. "Mrs. Brennan has been speaking with the guests in the dining room," Agnes said, choosing her words with a care that was its own kind of answer. "She's been describing the menu in some detail." Eliza set down the serving spoon. "What detail?" Agnes looked at her steadily. She told the Holts that she'd been planning the menu since the summer. She told the judge's wife that she'd trained in Chicago and that the bison preparation was based on a technique she'd adapted herself. A pause. She said it loud enough that most of the East tables heard it. The kitchen was quiet for a moment, except for the stoves. "Thank you, Agnes," Eliza said. She picked up the serving spoon and went back to plating. Her hands were steady. Her face was still. The only indication that she had heard and understood was a small, precise tightening around her eyes that she couldn't entirely prevent. She thought about what Cole had said that afternoon. "I don't know yet, but I'm not going to pretend it isn't happening." She thought about Martha's warning in the dry goods store. She told 3 separate people. She thought about the letter with its precise handwriting, as we discussed. She kept plating. The food was going out and it was good, and that was what she was here for, and she was not going to let anything interrupt it, not with 2 more courses and the cake still to come. She filed everything she was feeling into the part of herself that she dealt with later, after the work was done, alone in her kitchen at home. It was a very full filing system by this point. She had gotten efficient at it. The supper service began at 7 when the dancing started. The lighter dishes went out in rotations. The small, savory pastries, the cold, sliced meats, the bread she'd been pulling from the oven in fresh rounds since noon. The kitchen rhythm shifted from the sustained intensity of the dinner service to the more episodic pace of the supper, and Eliza allowed herself to breathe at a slightly different rate and think about the cake. The 4-tier anniversary cake stood on its decorated stand against the kitchen wall, finished now, the autumn botanicals placed in the arrangement she'd been designing since August. She had looked at it for a long time before the dinner service started, checking it from 3 different angles, making 2 small adjustments to the placement of the aster clusters on the 2nd tier, and then stepping back and acknowledging, in the private interior way she acknowledged such things, that it was the best single thing she had ever made. It would come out at 9 o'clock. She had 1 hour. At 8:15, Cole came down the back stairs. She heard him before she saw him. His step was distinct. She had learned it over a year of Tuesday mornings. And something in the quality of that step was different tonight. Faster. Not running, but urgent. He came through the kitchen door, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was still in the process of absorbing what it meant. "Eliza," he said. "I know," she said. "Agnes told me. It's gotten worse." His voice was controlled, the way a person's voice was controlled when they were actively working to keep it that way. The things she's been saying, in the main hall, in front of the East tables, in front of people who know, people like Holt who were at the cattle dinner in March, who heard your name said aloud." He stopped. She told them she hired a local woman to do basic prep work, and that she personally oversaw everything. Eliza was quiet. "Basic prep work," she repeated. "Yes." She turned back to the work table. She straightened a row of serving spoons that didn't need straightening. "How many people heard it?" "Most of the room by now." His jaw was tight. Word moves fast in that hall. She nodded slowly. She was doing the thing she did, filing, processing, converting the feeling into something manageable. She could feel it not quite converting this time. Something was resisting the filing. "There's more," Cole said. She turned back to look at him. He met her eyes. She said, he stopped, started again. She pointed out the apron, your apron, the initials. His voice had dropped. She said she'd had to... He looked like the words cost him something. She said she'd had to provide the woman with appropriate work clothing because the widow couldn't afford proper attire. She said it as a joke. People laughed. A pause. Not everyone, but some. The kitchen went very still. Eliza stood at her work table and looked at the apron. Her mother's careful stitching at the chest pocket, the E and M intertwined in the dark blue thread her mother had chosen specifically, the slight irregularity on the right side where she'd redone the stitch twice to get it right. Thomas had framed it once, had said it was the nicest piece of embroidery he'd ever seen, had been embarrassed to say so because it was a practical object, and sentiment about practical objects was not the currency of his vocabulary. She pressed her hand flat against the worn cotton. The filing system finally reached its limit. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice came out very quiet. She untied the apron strings, removed it from around her neck, and folded it carefully on the work table. She stood very still for a moment with her hands on the folded cloth. Cole watched her. He didn't speak. He understood, she thought, that she needed a moment that was only hers. "The cake goes out at 9, she said finally. "That doesn't change." "Eliza, the food is what I came here to do," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but there was something in it now, something that was not anger exactly, but was in the same family. "I'm going to finish what I came here to do, and then I am going to leave." He looked at her for a long moment. Something was working across his face, something she couldn't read because it was too large and too complicated to summarize in an expression. "I'm not going to let this stand," he said. "It's not your apron," she said. "No," he said, "but it is my house, and my name on that event. And I know whose hands made everything in that hall tonight." His voice was very even. "I know it, and Holt knows it, and Agnes knows it, and the judge's wife who actually asked the right questions knows it, and a dozen other people in that room know it, and the only reason they don't all know it is because I allowed an arrangement to exist that made the truth easier to avoid." He stopped. "I'm done allowing that." She looked at him for a long time. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to tell the truth," he said. "Simple. Final." "That will cause a scene." "Yes." "In front of 400 guests." "On your anniversary." "Yes." His eyes didn't move from hers. "I know what I'm doing." She held his gaze. "Cole." It was the first time she'd used his given name since that Sunday morning, and something registered in his expression at the sound of it. "This is not a small thing." "I know what it is," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up the folded apron and tied it back on. Slowly, with the same care she always used, the strings knotted at her back, the E and M at her chest. "Then go," she said. "The cake comes out at 9. I'll be ready." He went back up the stairs. She stood in the kitchen for 30 seconds with her hand on the work table. Then she turned to Dora, who had gone very still in the corner of the kitchen and whose eyes were very wide, and said, in her regular working voice, "Check the pastry rotation. They'll need another round in the hall in 10 minutes. Dora went. Agnes, who had been standing near the larder doorway and had heard most of it, looked at Eliza with an expression that contained several things at once. "Should I—" Agnes started. "Make sure the cake stand is positioned right when they bring it out," Eliza said. "The base needs to be centered, or the fourth tier will look off from the east side." Agnes nodded and went. Eliza stood alone in the kitchen and put both palms flat on the work table and looked at the wall in front of her and breathed in and out, the way she breathed when something was hard. She was shaking slightly, she realized. Her hands against the pine surface were trembling at a frequency she could feel but probably couldn't see. Not from fear, from the effort of holding the magnitude of this evening in a space that was not large enough for it. She breathed. Then she turned to the cake and began checking the final details. A pressure check on each dowel. The positioning of the topmost flower, which she adjusted one last time. She circled the stand slowly, looking at it from every angle, and it was exactly what she had intended it to be. 9 o'clock arrived. In the main hall above her, the fiddle had stopped. She could hear Cole's voice. She recognized its quality even through the floor and the distance, that careful, controlled evenness. She couldn't make out words. She heard the room go quiet. Then she heard something else, a shift in the ambient sound of 400 people. Not applause, not laughter, not the pleasant murmur of social comfort. Something different. Attention. A ripple saw. She thought, it started. Agnes came to the kitchen door. He's asking for the cake to come out, she said. Now. He wants it now. Eliza took one breath. All right. She picked up the base tier and went up the back stairs for the last time. Dora behind her with the second tier, Agnes with the third, one of the servers with the fourth, and the stand. They moved through the service corridor in silence. At the side entrance to the main hall, Eliza stopped. Through the gap in the door, she could see more than she'd ever seen from this position. The hall was lit by 100 candles and lanterns, and 400 people in their finest clothes were arranged around the long tables and the open dancing floor, and they were not dancing. They were still. Almost all of them were looking at the head table at the front of the room where Cole Brennan was standing. Madeline was standing too, a few feet to his left, with an expression Eliza could not read clearly from this distance. Something between social composure and a kind of tightening that wasn't quite composure. Cole was speaking. His voice carried in the quiet room the way a voice carried when a room had gone genuinely silent rather than merely polite. And I want to be clear, he was saying, because I should have been clear some time ago, about who is responsible for what you've eaten tonight. Not just tonight, for my wedding last year as well. He paused. The woman who designed this menu, the bison roast that I've been hearing about since the second course, the anniversary cake that you're about to see. Her name is Eliza Mercer. She runs a small bakery from her cottage on the east edge of Red Hollow. She is the best cook in this territory and possibly further. Another pause. She built everything you've eaten tonight with her own hands, from her own planning, and the only reason most of you don't know her name is because of an arrangement I allowed to exist that I am not proud of. The hall was absolutely silent. Eliza stood at the service door with the base tier of the cake in her hands. She heard Madeline's voice, sharp and social, from the front of the room, not loud enough to make out words from here, but the tone was clear, the tone of a woman attempting to recover a situation by redirecting it. She heard Cole's response, quieter and shorter, and then she heard something that she recognized even from this distance as a social collapse, the moment when a room collectively understood that the redirection wasn't going to work. She heard Samuel Holt's voice from somewhere in the hall, unmistakable even at this distance, large and certain. We know, most of us knew. A pause. I told half this room about Eliza Mercer in December. And then someone else, she couldn't identify the voice, said, not loudly but clearly, bring out the cake. Agnes pushed the door open. Eliza walked into the main hall of the Double B Ranch for the first time, carrying the base tier of an anniversary cake that she had spent 6 weeks building toward, wearing her mother's apron with the initials on the chest, in front of 400 people who had all simultaneously turned to look at her. Her legs were steady. She didn't know how that was possible, but they were. She walked to the table at the front of the hall where the cake stand was waiting, and she set the base tier down and checked the level, and then turned back for the second tier that Dora was carrying through the door behind her. And she assembled the cake in front of 400 people with the same hands and the same precision she would have used alone in her kitchen at midnight. The hall was quiet in a way that had texture to it. Not empty, not tense, but full of something she couldn't name, the particular quality of a large room of people who were witnessing something and knew it. She placed the fourth tier. She checked the dowels one last time. She adjusted the topmost aster by a quarter inch. She stepped back. She heard it again. The same sound she'd heard from the kitchen a year ago, the one that had come down through the floorboards. Except this time she was standing inside it. It was not applause yet. It was the thing before applause, the genuine involuntary sound of a large group of people responding to something before they had time to decide how to respond. The real version, not the performance of it. Then it became applause. Samuel Holt started it, which was not surprising given what she knew of him, and it spread from his table outward in seconds. Eliza stood at the front of the hall with her hands at her sides, and the sound of it fell over her like something physical, like the warmth of a room after coming in from the cold. She didn't smile. She was not quite sure her face was doing anything recognizable at all. She looked at Cole. He was standing a few feet away from her, and he was not applauding because he was looking at her, and his expression was the clearest she had ever seen it, uncomplicated, in a way she had not seen him uncomplicated before. Then she looked at Madeline. Madeline Pierce, Madeline Brennan, was standing at the head table with her hands at her sides and her face doing several things at once. She was a beautiful woman. Eliza had always acknowledged that without difficulty, and she had a social sophistication that was real and not merely performed. But right now that sophistication had nowhere to operate. The room had made its judgment, and it had made it loudly, and there was no redirect available. For a moment their eyes met across the hall. Eliza looked at her steadily, not with triumph, not with cruelty, not with the satisfaction of a wrong being corrected. With the same directness she used for everything. She was simply looking at a woman who had told a story that wasn't true and had believed, reasonably, that the architecture of the situation would protect that story, and had been wrong. Madeline looked away first. The applause continued. Someone near the back of the hall was standing, and then 3 more people, and then it became something she couldn't look at without feeling the shaking come back to her hands, so she turned and found Agnes at her elbow. "Come on," Agnes said quietly. "Come sit down." "I should go back to the kitchen." "The kitchen is handled," Agnes said. "Come sit down." Eliza let Agnes guide her to a small chair at the side of the hall, out of the direct focus of the room, and she sat in it and put her hands in her lap and looked at the floor and let the sound of the hall go on around her. From somewhere in the room, she heard a woman's voice, the judge's wife, she thought, say to the person beside her, clearly enough to carry, "I knew it. From the moment I tasted that bison roast, I knew it wasn't anyone's recipe, but the person who'd made it 100 times. And then from across the room, Holt again. "Send a bottle of the good whiskey to the kitchen." A pause. "No, she's not in the kitchen. Send it to her." Eliza sat in her chair and pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at her mother's initials on her apron chest and didn't cry, which she considered to be one of the harder things she had managed that evening. She was aware, peripherally, of Madeline leaving the hall. She did not watch her go. She was aware of Cole following briefly and then returning alone, and she understood without being told what had passed between them in the corridor outside. She understood it the way you understood some things before they were confirmed, not because of any single piece of evidence, but because the whole weight of the year pressed in one direction, and she had been trained by hard circumstance to pay attention to the weight of things. Cole came and stood near her. Not beside her, not yet. There was still a room full of people, and the evening still had its formal shape, but near. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. She looked up at him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's a fair answer." "I seem to be giving you a lot of those." He almost smiled. "I'll take honest over polished." From the front of the hall, the fiddle started up again, tentative at first and then with more confidence, and the room began the slow work of redistributing itself back toward festivity. People moved, conversations restarted. 2 men near the window were already at the cake, cutting the first slice, and she heard one of them say something to the other that produced a silence and then a look of genuine surprise, which was the almond and cherry combination in the second tier that she had been quietly proud of. She sat in her chair by the wall and let the evening move around her. She was a practical woman. She had been a practical woman for as long as she could remember, and she had been made more practical by 2 years of learning exactly how thin the margin was between stability and collapse. She did not let herself reach for things before they were real. But the room was warm, and the fiddle was playing, and 400 people had risen to their feet for her name, and somewhere to her left a man was standing near enough that she was aware of him the way she was aware of weather. Not as a fact she was analyzing, but as something she simply felt, in a way that bypassed the analytical part of her entirely. She picked up the glass of water someone had set beside her chair and drank it, and then she sat with her hands in her lap and the E&M against her chest, and she let herself carefully feel the full weight of what had happened in this hall tonight. Not triumphant, not vindicated. Something more complicated and more true than either of those. She had come into this hall through the front entrance. She had carried the cake through the front door and set it on the table in the light of 100 candles and stood in front of 400 people and let them see her face, and the ceiling had not fallen and the floor had not opened and she had not dissolved. She was still here. Still the same woman who had driven down this road in the dark with flour on her hands and $60 worth of necessity in her chest. The room had changed its understanding of her, but she had not changed. The quality of the work had been what it was, regardless of whether anyone knew her name. She had known it. She had always known it. That had been, she realized, the thing that had kept her. Not hope, not ambition, not the waiting for someone to finally notice, just the work itself, which was hers. which was true, which no back staircase in any house in the territory could make smaller than it was. Outside the windows of the main hall, the November dark had settled in completely, and the prairie beyond the ranch lights was invisible, just cold air and stars, and the long silence of open land. Somewhere out there was the road back to Red Hollow, and the cottage, and the stove, and the Tuesday mornings. She sat in her chair and let herself rest, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the full weight of the evening and decide she could carry it. Then she stood up, straightened her apron, and went to see about the cake. It needed serving. 400 people were waiting, and the almond cherry second tier was not going to describe itself. And that, in the end, was what she was here for. Not the scene, not the applause, not the politics of the room, but the fact of the thing she'd made, going out to the people who would eat it. She picked up the serving knife. She got back to work. She served the last slice of cake at 10:40 and was washing the serving knife when Agnes came to tell her that Madeline had taken a carriage back to town. Eliza set the knife in the drying rack. When? About an hour ago. Agnes folded a dish towel with the deliberate care of someone choosing their words at the same rate. She packed a bag from the upstairs room and left with the Harrington carriage, the family from Chicago. A pause. She didn't say goodbye to anyone that I saw. Eliza dried her hands. She thought about Madeline Brennan, Madeline Pierce again now, probably, in her own mind at least. In a carriage in the November dark, heading toward a town that would be talking about this evening for months. She did not feel satisfaction about that. She had expected to, maybe, and found that she didn't. What she felt was something closer to a tired neutrality, the acknowledgement of a thing that had happened without the energy to assign it a moral weight it would only carry temporarily anyway. "Is he all right?" she asked. Agnes looked at her for a moment. "He's in the study," she said. "He's been there since the guests started leaving." The guests had thinned out considerably over the last hour. The energy of the hall had shifted after the scene at the cake table, not unpleasantly but definitively, the way a room shifted when the central event had clearly already occurred and everything afterward was processing rather than anticipation. People had eaten the cake, which had been received with the specific kind of enthusiasm that embarrassed Eliza slightly and gratified her considerably, and then had said their farewells with the particular warmth of people who had witnessed something and felt included in it. Samuel Holt had come to the kitchen door personally at 10 o'clock. He was a large man with a blunt face and the handshake of someone who had spent 40 years meaning it, and he had looked at her and said, "Mrs. Mercer, my wife wants you to come to the house for Easter dinner. Not to cook it, to eat it." He'd paused. "She said to tell you that specifically, as a guest." Eliza had looked at him for a moment. "Tell her I'm grateful," she said. "You can tell her yourself," he said, "in April." And he'd gone. She finished the kitchen in the way she always finished a kitchen. Methodically, from the inside out, the surfaces last. Dora and the other helpers had gone home an hour ago with their wages, and Dora had hugged her, briefly and without asking permission, which had startled Eliza considerably and which she had not known how to respond to except to stand still and let it happen. Agnes was moving through the final tasks with her usual efficiency, and the two of them worked in the comfortable parallel silence they'd developed over 2 days a year ago and had simply resumed, as if the intervening year had been a pause rather than a gap. At 11:15, Agnes said, "Go talk to him." Eliza looked at her. "The kitchen's done," Agnes said, "and he's been sitting in that study for an hour and a half." She picked up her lamp. "I'm going to bed. Blow out the lamps when you're finished." She left before Eliza could object to the implication contained in "when you're finished," which was probably intentional. Eliza stood in the quiet kitchen. The stoves were banked. The surfaces were clean. The last evidence of the evening was the faint smell of bison and sugar and wood smoke that had settled into the walls the way cooking smells did in a kitchen that was used seriously. She untied her apron and folded it over the back of the chair. Then she picked it up and put it back on, which was a decision she made without entirely knowing why. She picked up a lamp and went through the kitchen door and across the yard toward the main house. The study was on the ground floor, east side, a room she had never been in. Light came from under the door. She knocked. "Come in," Cole said. He was sitting in a chair near the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand that appeared to be mostly full, which suggested he had poured it for something to do rather than to drink. The study was a working room, bookshelves with actual use, a desk that had papers on it, maps on the wall with notations in pencil, the general appearance of a space that was thought in rather than displayed. A fire burned low in the grate. He looked at her when she came in, and something in his face shifted. Not surprise, exactly, but relief. The kind that came from something you'd been waiting for without admitting you were waiting. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said. "I was finishing the kitchen," she said. "Right." He looked at his glass. "Sit down, if you want." She sat in the chair across from him. The fire put a low, warm light across the room, and outside the windows the prairie dark was complete, the kind of total November darkness that made the lit room feel like an island. "Are you all right?" she asked, the same question he'd asked her in the hall. He considered it seriously, which she appreciated. "I don't know yet," he said, and the echo was deliberate, and she saw it register in his eyes when she recognized it. "That's a fair answer," she said. He almost smiled. Then the almost smile faded, and he looked at the window, at the darkness outside. "It's been a long time coming," he said. "Not just tonight, the last year." He turned the glass in his hand. "I married someone I thought I knew, and I didn't know her well enough, which is a failure I own. That's not complicated." He paused. "What's complicated is that I knew it wasn't right before tonight, and I stayed in it anyway, and I told myself I was being reasonable, responsible." He said the words like they'd gone stale. "I was being a coward." Eliza looked at him steadily. She didn't offer him absolution or reassurance, which she suspected he wouldn't want and which would be a kind of condescension anyway. "What were you afraid of?" she asked. He looked at her. The question had landed somewhere real, and she could see him deciding whether to answer it honestly. "Embarrassment," he said finally, "which is a stupid reason to stay in a wrong situation. But there it is. 400 people, a county full of opinions, a wife from a family with connections in 3 states. He paused. "And I think, somewhere in it, I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. Eleanor died, and I spent a long time being wrong about most things, and it made me cautious in ways that weren't always useful." She sat with that. "Caution has its place," she said carefully. "It does," he said, "until it becomes a reason to not do the right thing." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, somewhere in the outbuildings, a horse moved. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, "but I'm going to start there. For last year. For the arrangement I allowed. For taking too long to say what I knew to be true." He met her eyes directly. "I should have said it at the wedding. I should have said it in the months after. I let things be what they were because it was easier than making them what they should have been." She looked at him for a long time. In the warm light of the study, he looked tired and honest, and not particularly like the powerful man whose name everyone in the territory knew, which she found she respected more than the version of him that was impressive from a distance. "I accepted the arrangement," she said, "both times. I knew what I was agreeing to." "You agreed because you had no good alternative," he said. "That's not the same as it being all right." "No," she said, "it's not." She paused. "But I also made a choice. Each time. I chose the work over the dignity of the arrangement because the work was what I could control and the rest of it wasn't." She looked at her hands, the rough knuckles, the small scar on her right index finger from a knife slip 3 years ago. "I've been doing that my whole life, choosing what I can control." "Is that a criticism of yourself?" he asked. She thought about it. "I'm not sure. It kept me standing when a lot of things were trying to knock me over." A pause. "But I think I also used it as a reason not to want anything I couldn't be certain of." The fire made a small sound. The room was very quiet. "I want to ask you something," Cole said, "and I want you to know that the answer won't change anything about what I've already said tonight. This isn't conditional." She looked at him. "I would like—" He stopped, started again. "I'd like the chance to know you properly, not as the person who cooks for my events, not as a transaction." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm asking for the chance to deserve being asked." Eliza sat in the chair across from him and looked at the man who had stood up in front of 400 people and said her name because it was the right thing to do. Who had corrected the terms of her engagement without telling her he'd done it. Who had refilled her coffee without asking and laughed genuinely at a dry observation and told her about Eleanor's favorite day of the year at a delivery window in April. Who was, she thought, not a perfect man. Was cautious where he should have been brave, had stayed too long in a wrong situation and called it responsibility. Had a way of deciding things quietly and alone that she suspected would frustrate her in the long run. An imperfect man who was, at this moment, being more honest than most people managed on their best days. "You already know me fairly well," she said. "I know some of you," he said. "The parts you allow at a delivery window and in a kitchen." He paused. "I'd like to know the rest." She looked at him for a long moment. The cautious part of her, the part that had been running the household accounts and the risk assessments and the careful management of expectations for 2 years, was present and had opinions. It knew all the ways this could be wrong. It had a list. She had always been good at lists. She was also sitting in a warm study at the end of the longest evening of her life, and the man across from her had just dismantled his own social world in front of 400 witnesses because he thought the truth mattered more than the convenience of not saying it. And she had learned, in 2 years of narrow margins and hard winters, that the things which were true had a weight that was different from the things which were merely convenient or safe or probable. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right." "Don't make it a bigger thing than I said," she said. "It's not a promise. It's a chance. You said that's what you wanted." "It is," he said. And he didn't push it, didn't qualify it or expand it, which was exactly the right response, and which she noted carefully in the part of herself that was always paying attention. She stood. "I need to get back to town. I have bread to start in the morning." He stood too. "I'll have someone hitch your wagon." "I can hitch my own wagon." "I know you can," he said. "I'd like to do it anyway." She looked at him. "That's not going to become a pattern." "No," he agreed. "But tonight it can be." She picked up her lamp. He walked with her across the yard to where her wagon was waiting, and he hitched the horse with the efficiency of a man who had been doing it since childhood, and she stood beside him in the cold November dark and watched him work without feeling the need to fill the silence with anything. When it was done, he stood back and she climbed up to the seat and gathered the reins. "Eliza," he said. She looked down at him. "The cake," he said. "The fourth tier, the flavor." I couldn't place it. She looked at him for a moment. "Dried apple and brown sugar, and a small amount of black walnut." She paused. "It's an autumn flavor, the kind that tastes like the end of something and the start of something else at the same time." He looked up at her in the dark. "That's a very precise description." "I'm a precise person," she said. And she clicked to the horse and drove out of the Double B Ranch down the south road toward Red Hollow. She drove in the dark with the cold air on her face and the stars overhead. There were a great many of them on a clear November night, the kind of sky that had no interest in being modest about its scale. The prairie on both sides of the road was invisible, just darkness and the sound of the wind in the dry grass. And the horse moved at its steady pace with the familiarity of a road it had traveled enough times to trust. She thought about the evening. All of it, in sequence, the way she processed the things that needed processing, without softening them or dramatizing them, just looking at them for what they were. The kitchen at 5 in the morning, and the bison shoulder and Dora's wide eyes and Agnes's deliberate sentences. The sound of Cole's voice coming through the floorboards. The moment she had walked through the front door carrying a cake she had built with 6 weeks of thought and 2 days of labor and the full weight of everything she knew how to do. She thought about Madeline in the carriage heading toward town. She had thought, when she was first offered the anniversary engagement, that Madeline Pierce was a woman who measured people by what they owned and who they knew and what story could be constructed around them. She had been right about that. But sitting with it now, on the road home, she could also see something else. A woman who had arrived in a territory that had no use for her particular sophistications, who had tried to assert herself through the only currency she'd brought with her, who had made a mistake that was born from insecurity rather than pure malice. That didn't excuse it. The apron comment had been cruelty, and cruelty was cruelty regardless of its origins. But Eliza was 30 miles past needing Madeline Pierce to be a villain in order to make sense of her own story. Her own story was hers. It had always been hers. That was the thing she was still learning to hold on to fully. That the shape of her life was not determined by the people who tried to make her invisible, but by what she chose to do in the spaces between. She had chosen bread when she could have chosen bitterness. She had chosen precision when she could have chosen just enough. She had chosen, tonight, to fold her apron and pick it back up, which was a small gesture in a large room, but she knew what it meant, and she thought Cole had known too. Red Hollow appeared in the middle distance, its lights small and scattered against the dark. She could make out the hotel, the dry goods store, the boarding house, the architecture of her daily life, which was ordinary and unglamorous and absolutely real in a way that the anniversary hall with its 100 candles had not been. She turned down the eastern road toward the cottage. The fire was out when she got home, which she'd expected. She'd banked it carefully before leaving that morning, but 10 hours was 10 hours. She built it back up with the practiced speed of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and while the room was still cold, she put on the kettle and got out her notebook and sat at the kitchen table. She turned to a new page. At the top she wrote, "Spring menu, new ideas." Below that she wrote 3 dishes she'd been thinking about since August, things she hadn't tried yet, combinations that were still theoretical but had a logic she could feel. She wrote notes on each. She crossed out one and rewrote it. She made a small sketch of a cake design that had been forming in the back of her mind for weeks. Simpler than the anniversary cake, quieter, but with a detail in the sugar work that she thought might be the most interesting thing she'd ever attempted. The cottage warmed slowly around her. The kettle came to a boil, and she made her tea and sat with it, and the notebook, and the sounds of the house settling in the wind. The mortgage was current. The woodpile would hold through March. Samuel Holt's wife had invited her to Easter dinner as a guest. Somewhere south of town, a man had asked, plainly and without maneuvering, for the chance to know her properly, and she had said all right, which was not a small thing, though she had said it quietly. She had a lot of work to do. There were new dishes to develop and spring events to plan, and a professional reputation that was, for the first time, something she could actually build on rather than simply protect. Martha Greer had said, when Eliza stopped into the dry goods store the week before, that 3 different women had asked about her in October, all of them looking for catering work for various spring occasions, and had Martha pass along their names. 3 names. That was new. That was the beginning of something that had a different shape than survival. She sat at her kitchen table and finished her tea and looked at the notebook page and thought about what she was building. It was not the life she had planned when she and Thomas drove into Red Hollow on a wagon with a broken axle and nothing certain. That life had been his as much as hers and had ended in February 2 years ago, and she had grieved it genuinely and would not pretend otherwise. But grief was not the same as being stopped. She had never been stopped. She had bent in every direction the wind came from, and she had not broken, which was not something she'd done gracefully or without cost, but she had done it. She thought about what Cole had said in the study. I let things be what they were because it was easier than making them what they should have been. She recognized that. She had done her own version of it, had called acceptance wisdom, had called endurance enough, had filed away the things that mattered in the part of herself she didn't visit too often because the visiting was expensive. She had been so focused on not losing what she had that she had sometimes forgotten to reach for what she wanted. She was 30 miles past being sure what she wanted, specifically. But she knew she was no longer afraid to find out. She closed the notebook. She washed her cup. She went to bed, and she slept cleanly. And in the morning she got up before 4 and built the fire and measured the flour and started the bread the way she had started every morning for 3 years, with her hands and her skill and the particular kind of patience that was not passive but active. The patience of someone who understood that the good things required time and that the time was not wasted but necessary was in fact part of the making. The dough was cold and resistant at first, as it always was. She worked it with the heel of her hand, folded it, turned it, worked it again. Gradually it warmed. Gradually the resistance became cooperation, the tight mass becoming something that moved with her instead of against her. Outside the cottage windows, Red Hollow was still dark. The prairie beyond it was still dark. The whole cold territory was still in the last hour before dawn, the hour that belonged to the people who were already working, who had always been working, who would still be working when the light came up and the day organized itself around them. Eliza shaped the loaves with steady hands. She slid them into the oven and set her timer and poured her first coffee of the morning and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark yard and the bare garden and the slow lifting of the sky at its eastern edge. It was not a dramatic thing, what she had built. It was bread and pies and careful preparation and the willingness to do difficult work well without requiring anyone to notice. It was 16-hour days and cold mornings and the arithmetic of a life that had refused, stubbornly and without elegance, to collapse. But it was hers, every bit of it. The flower on her hands and the initials on her apron and the notebook full of ideas and the name that 400 people now knew. It was entirely, completely, unambiguously hers. Nobody in Red Hollow would forget that name. She already knew it. She always had.